Hi, this is Ren.
This is Casey, and this is another episode of Drunk Walks of Film. We just watched the Netflix original Stephen King adaptation, 1922, which I think we both really enjoyed. But it brought to mind to me something I've been thinking about really critically since I saw Peter Jackson's King Kong movie. And I know it came out in 2005. I didn't see it until 2008, I think. And I've seen it, I think, 3 times. But my question is, how do you make a convincing period film with contemporary technology? And the reason why I started thinking about this a lot with the Peter Jackson King Kong movie specifically is because that was the first movie that I watched. And I was really just like, wow! I don't buy this as a period film at all, because everybody looks very modern, everything looks very shiny, new, nothing feels 1920s. I mean, I know the original film was 1930s, so I guess 1930s, but it kind of raises the question of, if you're not going to go the route of the artist, where you're specifically going to do a period film in silent film, in black and white, on film, with, the little talkie subtitle text box, which works great for the artist, and I love the artist for that. I adore the artist very much, but that's not the feeling you need with every period piece.
Right. Schindler's List, although not a silent film, invokes sort of the same thing because, it's in black and white.
Mm-hmm. But they use contemporary technology with things like the red coat.
Right.
You're right. Schindler's List is a great example of something where I buy the time period immediately.
Yeah, it's something about the black and white that makes it feel more authentic than it would have ever felt if it were in color.
Yeah, and you can do that with a lot of things, like Good Night and Good Luck is in black and white as well.
Which is not to say that things can't look period if they're in color.
That's kind of what I'm getting at, is I'm not against using contemporary technology to create period pieces. But it just becomes a point of, how do you do that convincingly? For example, I don't like the movie Hugo very much. The reason being is because I was a longtime fan of the book, The Invention of Hugo Cabret. That was kind of the book that got me into movies, actually. Because I grew up without television, I grew up kind of without movies. And that book is like a living movie. And it's a book that's about Georges Méliès, and that's kind of how I learned about Trip to the Moon. And I started looking up all of his movies that I could find on YouTube, and started getting really invested in how do you do movies, how do you do production design, how do you do, practical effects on film. And it's a really great book about, the history, but also it's very nitty-gritty, whereas the movie is very whimsical. But the movie does something kind of interesting, and also doesn't do it very well, where it tries to do film special effects throughout the history of movies, which, they have really incredible CGI. Truly incredible green screen CGI effects that look extraordinarily realistic. And you can watch online a behind the scenes of the scene where the train drives out of the train station and crashes into the road in front of the station from the second floor. And it looks phenomenal. But you can see behind the scenes how much of it is fake. And it's really incredible. And things like that, I think, are great to have in period pieces. I don't see any reason why we can't be using modern technology to enhance the feel of period, when you can't always have period-accurate backgrounds. You don't always have the time, you don't always have the money, you don't always have the tax write-offs, you don't always have the people actually to build the sets. Although there are movies where you do have that. True Grit, they built a fake old western town. And you can see behind the scenes featurettes and photos, and it looks amazing in real life, and then it also looks amazing on film.
Sleepy Hollow was another movie that built a town from the ground up.
Yes, and I think that all the problems with Sleepy Hollow aside, The sets are great. But going back to another Tim Burton movie that didn't do this well at all, Sweeney Todd's sets are almost all green screen. And you can tell, and it looks bad. Like, the movie doesn't look good. It really doesn't. And I will fight to the death on that, because I know a lot of people like the Tim Burton Sweeney Todd movie, and I don't, because I think it's kind of a pussy adaptation of it. I really do. But besides that, it doesn't look good, and it's not a cinematic adaptation. It looks like a filmed version of a crappy stage play. And honestly, you can watch the recorded stage play with Angela Lansbury, and it's incredible. Like, it's so much better, to the point where the movie, the Tim Burton movie, is actually stealing shots. Like, they're stealing specific setups from the recording of the stage play. Not the point. My point is you can watch Sweeney Todd, which uses CGI as a crutch, and it looks like it. It looks like it. It looks fake. It looks like crap. It looks dreary and bland. And it looks like nobody exists. But, like I said, then there's also movies like Hugo, where the CGI can really enhance the feel of it. With Hugo, though, the problem with using all of the, like, different methods of CGI, or not of CGI, I'm sorry, of practical visual special effects throughout history, while that's a really cute homage, it doesn't translate very well to a lot of people. Like, I watched it for a second time with a bunch of my friends from film school, and they were very confused by it. They didn't like it at all until I pointed out, like, that's specifically what they were going for. You can't really commit to doing both modern techniques and old-timey techniques. Like, you have the vignettes, and you have, you know, the edits, and, like, the one that always confuses people, and Hugo specifically, is the stop-motion animation with the robot mouse. Because there is so much CGI that looks so real once you have, like, the scene where, you know, a lot of people who aren't really fans of stop-motion specific will look at them and be like, oh, that looks so fake and dumb. Because it doesn't fit. When you watch something like any given Ray Harryhausen movie, you buy into it because that is the law of that film. It doesn't work when you're just, like, cherry-picking and putting it into scenes for the sake of doing it. So then it becomes a thing of, like, well, where do you draw the line? Where do you use contemporary effects, and where do you use traditional effects?
One director that has done an amazing job of it is David Fincher. Specifically the movie Zodiac, which uses an excessive amount of CGI. And you listening to this right now might go, I didn't notice any CGI. Yeah. That's pretty much, and the reason why he did it was to make it slavishly period accurate.
Mm-hmm. It's like that saying, like, CGI is awful, except for all the times when it's not. You know, CGI is awful when you can look at it and tell that that's what it is, but CGI is beautiful when it's used for world building and creation in a way that makes it feel very real and alive and period or fantasy or sci-fi, you know.
Yeah, there's HBO miniseries about John Adams that I saw some of the CGI effects, and that was really impressive. Going on to period accurate. Now, I'm embarrassed to say that I own the film, but I haven't seen the film yet. One of the films that I heard was the most period accurate movie. One of the most period accurate movies ever to exist is a movie called Master and Commander.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Which gets into a lot of the nitty-gritty details of, like, old school nautical navigation and combat and all that sort of stuff. I'm really fascinated to see the movie for that reason. I, being somebody who was in the Navy, obviously not during that period, but, you know, to see, like, a earlier time and how people had to struggle to navigate and fight in the sea.
Mm-hmm. Well, going back to 1922, I was kind of looking at a lot of it and trying to figure out how much of it was practical and how much of it was CGI. I kind of get a feeling that a lot of the town and like the scene at the train station were probably CGI, but not to put down the film because they looked very real. It was just literally me looking at it, trying to constructively think about how do you make a good period film with contemporary technology, that I was thinking, is this CGI or is this not? I don't know if that's true at all. I don't know if it's practical or if it's CGI. I will say in this movie, the sets were all very good. And this movie kind of brought to the forefront, I think, maybe the two biggest problems with contemporary period films, especially period films that exist during the time where we had film. I feel like you can get away with a lot more of things that existed before, like 1890. You know, if you do, let's say, Amadeus. I feel like you can kind of get away with a lot more because, well, we don't have footage of that. We don't have photographs of that, you know? You don't have to be slavish to style. Even though the movie was, to, like, an excruciatingly gorgeous extent. But with a movie like this, I think the two biggest problems that come up, well, a movie like this and the Peter Jackson King Kong movie, and then even the Kong Skull Island movie, I think, two of the biggest problems come down to, I think, cinematography and costuming. And to sort of point to a movie that did this well, even though I didn't like the movie, I think Hacksaw Ridge is a pretty fluffy movie, and everything having to do with the war scenes is shot horrendously in terms of continuity or emotional development. But if you look at like the first half of the movie, I think a lot of the makeup and costuming and cinematography does a really great, and sets do a really great job of convincing the film of the time period, where all of the costumes are made with period fabric and in period style. And then they did a lot of makeup and styling to emulate actors that look modern to look like typical body types and facial types of the period. One thing I've been pointing out is how they make Andrew Garfield look really doughy. And he doesn't look like that. We've all seen The Amazing Spider-Man. And they do a really amazing job with hair, makeup, costuming to make it, and sets, to make everything feel very vintage. Because there's a lot of weight to the sets, and I mean physical weight. Everything feels kind of heavy in it, in a very time-accurate way. And then they do a lot of really clever things to sort of do things like make his neck seem a lot longer, make him seem like he has less of a chin, things like that. Versus you have a movie like 1922 or King Kong, where you have such high-definition video footage that you can see every detail in the costuming, in the sets, in their makeup, in like the dirt and grime on their face. And you can see, oh, the fabric in their costumes looks too light, it looks too sheer, it looks too modern, because you can practically count the thread count because it's so high definition, and you can see how perfect and shiny everything looks. Versus in 1922, like if you look at the sets, you can see the wallpaper looks dirty, or you have a cut in the wallpaper in the middle of the wall, which makes sense for like a poor farmhouse. You know, they probably did the wallpaper themselves and didn't do like mathematical calculations to see how well the wallpaper would work. They probably threw it up, and when they got to the end of the roll, they put a little bit of a strip more. That's what it looks like. And you have things like the rotting roof, and you have like the woodworking, and you have like the shingles on the outside, and it all looks very poor and kind of broke down and not very well maintained. But then there are some really great ideas in production design, like you have the father and the son who want to be farmers, and they're covered in dirt and their clothes are really worn out, and then you have the wife who looks very different because she wants to be like a dressmaker, and she wants to go out into like the rustle and bustle of the city of Omaha, which is appropriately hilarious. And she dresses in reds, and she dresses, like, in the height of fashion with, like, her little bucket hat and her, like, perfectly ruffled, you know, like, sort of flapper-inspired dress that's, like, clearly taken from patterns of the time period. It was a great touch to, like, add to the fact that she's on a farm where, like, her hat doesn't match her clothes at all. Like, it doesn't look very cute, but it works. The problem is that everything looks so light. It looks like their shirts are not made out of cotton or wool. It looks like her clothes are made out of, like, maybe, like, a chiffon almost. And then she's, like, making a dress that's made out of, like, like a shiny poly mix, where, like, they didn't have that back then. And a lot of things look just so shiny and new because you have such high quality camera work. Where, you know, when you look at older movies, a lot of the details sort of blur together because you can't see everything. So does it come down to, like, do you really need to shoot on film as long as you're shooting a period piece just so you don't get every detail? So things look more period accurate? Or does it come down to, like... I mean, I think, personally, as a production design person, you do need to go period fabric all the way. You just need to invest the money and do that. But... how do you really do that balance of making something look good and make something look period, where you suck people in and you don't make people think, like, this is, you know, Mickey Mouse stuff?
Well, I mean, one great recent example of a film that went period and went slavish into the detail, partly because the movie was directed by somebody who had previously done production design work, and that was the movie The Witch.
I knew you were going to say that, yes!
They had the fabric accurate. I know some people complained about a certain hat, but if you do your research and not just look at photos and various drawings and stuff, like, that hat is period as well. Mm-hmm. Like...
You're talking about the beanie, aren't you?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There is nothing in that movie that isn't period except for the color of Thomason's dress.
The pink dress?
Yeah. There's like a slight pink color, and I think that's just a character choice that they decided to go with. The color doesn't necessarily seem period accurate, but it's so
washed out.
Yeah, it's so washed out, and that's such a minor nitpick that, like,
there is no such thing as a minor nitpick when you're talking about period pieces.
Okay.
But on the other hand, well, I do agree with you. The Witch is a great example of something that immediately sucks the audience in as feeling appropriately time period accurate. That's also pre-1890.
Yeah, it gets a lot more difficult. One of the things that always bothers me is seeing things take place in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the 70s always seems to be the weird period where everybody creates this hyper stylized thing, and people oftentimes forget that not everybody is fashionable.
You know what was a great 70s period piece?
What?
The second season of Fargo. Because it was exactly like you said. Not everybody was really fashionable or wearing really exaggerated 70s looks. But you look at it and you're like, oh, that's 1970s. But it doesn't look like a 1970s disco Halloween costume sort of a thing, you know?
Yeah, that's the big problem with a lot of stuff. It's like, oh... you saw Saturday Night Fever and figured that was the only place.
Actually, that is a problem I've heard a lot of people, like really respected people, complain about, is when you do time period research, you can't look at movies and TV shows. If you're doing turn of the century, aristocratic, you can't look at Downton Abbey and say that's your research. You have to look at actual books and patterns and photos and videos as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, that was the problem that we both had with, even though it's a fantasy movie, it still is trying to be period, and that's the Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them.
Oh, that was so awful at costume period because everything.
And it won the Oscar too,
which drove me fucking crazy. Although I was glad that La La Land didn't win for their yellow jersey dress, but. The problem with Fantastic Beasts is everything looked like, oh, we're doing a Prohibition party. Get your Great Gatsby movie costumes from the year that came out of your closet and wear that to a professional set. It didn't work at all. It didn't feed into the previous designs of Harry Potter. And it didn't feed into, like, historically accurate 1920s.
Yeah, that was the biggest issue that I had with the film. I understand that it takes place in the United States and costumes would be different, but like people in Europe and people in the United States during the 1920s dressed similar enough that like...
No.
Okay.
Well, I mean, Americans were far more risque in the 1920s than they were in the UK.
But I mean, like, you would have something... If you're talking about like Hogwarts and all that kind of stuff, like
well, that's what killed me is like you have this production design that you built for 8 movies, and you didn't utilize that very much.
Yeah, and if I'm gonna have only like one nitpick about the Harry Potter movies, it would be that the production design reminds me a little too much of the BBC production of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the various Chronicles of Narnia movies.
I don't agree with that because I think that the production design was far better in those movies than it was in Fantastic Beast. When you look at, what is her name? The Queen? The White Queen? The evil one?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have a lot of visual imprints of the movie, but I don't remember the names very well. Please forgive me. I watched the VHS a lot when I was a little kid. But it's been a long time.
I watched that so many times.
Dude, it was so scary though because they would do like it was one of those things where like it came as 2 VHS tapes and the breaking point between part 1 and part 2 was the screaming book, and it would always freak me out when I was a little kid because I'd be like, I gotta put it back in. The screaming book just freaks me out.
Well, I also thought it was like really creepy because like they would go from wolves to lycanthropes because, you know, it would turn into an actor. But there was something creepy about that transformation. Like they were always wolves to a certain extent. Yeah,
absolutely. But like even a lot of the animal forms were a lot more convincing than like the CGI fantastical beasts.
But that being said, there are several good examples. One of the things that I get really frustrated though is, in speaking of production design, in more recent films, there seems to be a camera technique that has become really popular and really prevalent, which is hyper-focused foreground and everything else in the background is blurred. It's so frustrating to me as somebody who like really likes to dig into film, especially when I purposely get Blu-rays to like really explore some of the stuff in the backgrounds of films. You know, you look at the films in the 70s, you look at some earlier films, and there's some beautiful subtext going on with various things. And like when you make everything blurry, my eyes can't wander. And I find that so frustrating. And it seems that so many film productions, I get that time is probably what's driving a lot of this, but also I personally think that they're making a lot of shows and movies to be viewed on phones.
That could very well be true. I haven't thought of that, but now that you say it, that makes sense. I will say that was something I was thinking about during 1922, was that is something that is so 20 teens that's going to be dated in a little while. And I'm not saying dated in a bad way, but it is going to be one of those hallmarks of the 20 teens, is that was the thing we were doing at that time, was really hyper-focused foregrounds and really blurry backgrounds. And that was a thing that was going on in 1922. But if you look at Professor Marston and the Wonder Women, which I think did a brilliant job of like doing period very well. Or if you look at Loving, which really just brought you into that time period. Or even I think Hidden Figures, which had a lot of problems with makeup and hairstyling that was way too modern. Like they were using like contemporary MAC retro colors instead of things that were actually color period to the time. But a lot of those were filmed with, you can see the foreground and you can see the background, versus 1922, where you can see the foreground so perfectly that you can see that the costuming is too light and made up, and you can't see any of the background.
And I can understand...
Versus anything that's period, where you can see the foreground, the middle ground, and the background.
And I can understand if you're doing it for a certain narrative style, like if you're trying to film it in a certain way, like let's look at The Handmaid's Tale, which has very shallow depth of field because you're trying to get into the space of, you know, somebody's thoughts and their fears and all that kind of stuff. And that's not really what we're talking about because, you know, obviously there are ways to use these techniques that fit the narrative. I'm just saying that it seems like creative shorthand that is, I'm going to say a little lazy.
I agree. With something like The Handmaid's Tale, doing something like that not only works very well for giving a sense of narrative perspective from a show don't tell kind of an idea, but also that is something that needs to be very modern looking. It has to feel very contemporary. Even if it doesn't age well, that is a show that's very specifically trying to address issues of our times versus doing something that's a period piece. You know, there's obviously a lot of callbacks to sort of old-fashioned lifestyles, but this is in the distant future, the year 2000, very close dystopian society. We're trying to make it feel as close to our times as possible. So it makes sense to use what's popular to do now, but when you do something like, you know, King Kong or 1922, that's supposed to be period, and it just feels so contemporary, it brings you out of it too much. You can't buy into the period.
One of the things that this is probably one of the best pieces of advice given to me by a professor is this concept of watch the mediocre to bad movies of a certain time to get a real understanding of the feel of the time, because they'll feel dated and that's what you want.
I totally agree with that. That's a good idea.
If you're trying to get a feel for a certain period of time, maybe watch some raw footage of like musicians talking and, you know, maybe look at the crowd of people. Maybe watch, you know, documentary footage of, you know, stuff at that time. Preferably
or news
stuff
footage if you can.
Yeah, preferably stuff that isn't fluffed up, because when you get into certain periods of time, media was very controlled, and certain aspects of life were fluffed up and artificial. I mean, the way that news anchors talk in films in like the 50s and all that kind of stuff, like that's not really how people talked, but it was like something that was like adapted. Now, that being said, there were people that were taught that certain vernacular. I mean, my grandfather was one of those, so it was kind of interesting, like when I was talking to him and I was like, oh yeah, this just kind of sounds of a time.
Yeah, and you can get away with creative liberties. The problem is when even a layman can go into a movie and just not feel the period. For example, even with Loving, which I really appreciated the costume design and the hair and makeup and the production design, especially because the wife made all of her own clothes, and her clothes always looked very well done but homemade and very period. But even you had to bring up, oh, that set of dishes that she's washing, I own that set of dishes, and my mother gave me those. Those are from the 1970s.
I'm actually not sure about that. Because apparently those are actually antique dishes, and I might need to look into those.
That say microwave safe on the back?
Yeah.
Because those dishes do say something about like their microwavability. That seems very contemporary.
I don't know.
But that aside, you could use dishes as a prop, but the movie still feels of the time. Yeah. So how do you really get that feeling? That's really what I'm trying to get at. Does it really come down, do you think, to production design and cinematography put together? Or is there maybe like a specific kind of direction? Or do you really have to go with the crappy like square aspect ratio, black and... I don't think you really need to do that with every period film. I think that's way too much.
One of the things that was interesting about the movie, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, was, as the time periods progressed, they did change the film stock with various time periods when they were looking back at things. So like, when you're looking at a certain time period, it's like, oh yeah, films look like this at this time. And they really kind of emulated that. And I thought that was a really interesting way to show a time period. And I think that, that's certainly one way to do it. I think also when making a period piece, it's certainly helpful to have people that lived in that period helping you. Obviously, not all the time can you do that.
Like 1922.
Right. There are enough photographs during that time. And, from like the 1900s onwards, like you can do your research. It's just how much money do you want to invest in production time and all that kind of stuff. And one of the biggest problems with a lot of films and stuff nowadays is they're churning them out like really fast.
Especially something like a Netflix original.
Yeah. Speaking of Netflix originals, I have to bring this up because this is sort of a thing that's become really popular over the past couple of years, and that is 80s retro. You saw it with Stranger Things. You have it with the new It.
Which I haven't seen, but I will say with Stranger Things, that seemed very downplayed, time period appropriate.
Right.
That didn't seem so over the top. Oh, it's 80s, you guys, don't you see? Like, to the point where it's like, did people really do that?
I think like some of the movie posters were a little too obvious.
Well, yes, because those are movie posters, and in general, movie posters are too obvious.
Right, but
we've had a problem with like retro movie posters that I've really disliked when you really don't need them. For example, with Mother, you had gorgeous original illustrated posters that were amazing and kind of said everything you needed to know about the movie to go see it. And then you had to do the Rosemary's Baby posters where it's just like, oh, come on.
I wasn't talking about the Stranger Things posters like like advertising material and stuff like that. I was talking about like the actual posters, like Jaws and like various other things.
There is a thing of a lot of Stranger Things isn't period accurate.
Right.
Where like they're using D&D models that are not period accurate, or they're talking about the thing, but that's actually not period accurate. I get that. But does it feel period accurate when you're watching it?
Or they go to the theater, see Risky Business, and apparently, like, Risky Business didn't come out until, like, later that year.
Right. I get that, but, like I'm saying, obviously it's better when everything is perfect, but there is sort of a difference between what can you watch as a casual viewer that feels period versus something that you're immediately taken out of because it feels too contemporary. Stranger Things feels period, even though it's not.
Yeah.
We can nitpick it, but it feels like 1982.
And then there are also other cases of movies and TV shows that try to create sort of a timeless feel that will use elements of the modern times, but also mesh it in with some of the older stuff. Like, one of the things about Breaking Bad is they never used iPhones. It was always flip phones and all that kind of stuff, which kind of gave it its own time period.
Although, on the other hand, you have South Park, which is very obvious with its iPhones because it's trying to be very contemporary. And I think to a certain extent, South Park is trying to seem dated to us now, to try to sort of highlight like how silly a lot of things are in terms of things like our technological obsessions.
Well, and speaking of South Park, I actually like when South Park tries to be as relevant as possible to the moment that we're in right now, because, 6 days to air and all that kind of stuff. That just seems to work best for them.
Well, the interesting thing where you try to be as relevant to a time period, like a modern contemporary time period as possible. Modern and contemporary do not mean the same thing. Contemporary time period as possible is that you kind of like are gambling with, will this also be relevant in the future? Because you see this a lot where you see things from the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1980s, the 1990s, where it's like, look at how this is still prevalent to our society today, sort of a thing. And it's kind of a gamble. Is it really going to be something that is still going to be an issue? But when it's something like South Park, where you're talking about systemic political issues that have been a part of the American government for the past, really, as long as we've had an American government, yeah, you can bet that if you say something really relevant, when people look at it 10, 20, 30 years from now, they'll be like, oh, look, this is still relevant, even though they're fucking around on their iPhones or whatever. And we don't have those, but, they're talking about, I can't choose between, a giant douche and a turd sandwich. That's something that's always going to be relevant to our American, quote-unquote, democracy. Which is kind of interesting. And I always really, in terms of, time periods, I love it when movies are using a specific time period to highlight contemporary issues. Like, The Nice Guys was brilliant at that. They were talking about a lot of contemporary issues, but putting it in the context of the 1970s to highlight how little progress we've made. Even though we keep talking about it, we keep protesting about it, we're still in the same position we were in some 40 years ago. I think that's a situation where doing sort of like a dated period or doing a period in sort of a contemporary style can really shine. Right.
Arthur Miller did it with the Crucible, talking about blacklisting and everything like that, because it's pretty much common knowledge the Crucible isn't about the Salem witch trials, it's about the Hollywood blacklist.
Right, exactly.
Well, the blacklist in general.
Yeah, but that was a pretty big Hollywood thing. But kind of going back to my original point, even if you're trying to take a period piece and make it contemporary, does that mean it should look contemporary? Or if you're not trying to make it contemporary and you're trying to make it timeless, does that mean you have to shoot on film footage? Even though there's a lot of movies that are trying to be even more realistic, more futuristic. You had Interstellar that was shot on film, which looked beautiful, but that was supposed to be very sci-fi futuristic, the distant year, the year 2000 sort of a feel. Versus Dunkirk, where it was shot on film and it looks very period.
Well, Chris Nolan just likes shooting on film.
Exactly. Right? He's kind of like a Quentin Tarantino, where he's like, oh, well, I can do the 70 millimeter. I'm gonna do that just because I can, whether or not it fits the movies that I'm working with. Not to say
there's a very different look between film and digital, and there are ways to push digital to make it look more like film, but film gives you a lot more leeway that digital doesn't. Digital has a lot of shortcomings to it because you have to set things right and everything like that. Yeah, there are a lot of limitations with digital. In post, there's more you can do with film than there is that you can do with digital.
But with digital, you can always see things immediately. With film, you're not going to know until you see the footage days or weeks later.
I think the best example to give you is compare a film camera with an iPhone or something like that. Shoot something at the complete wrong aperture, totally fuck up the shot. On film, you can actually expose it more to light, do some doctoring and all that kind of stuff. And you can actually bring out that footage.
But
on digital, that's been washed out. There isn't the data there.
that is a really good point, but at the same time, there is the problem of A, it's more expensive, B, you have less and less people who actually know how to work with that, and
True.
C, you're not going to have that immediate result that you have with digital. You're not going to immediately have a backup, immediately have a playback, immediately know what you got and what you didn't get.
Well, I personally am biased towards digital, even though what I said might sound the other way. I'm biased towards digital because I say that the story should come first, and all your fancy camera work doesn't mean shit if you don't have, a good story, good blocking, good ideas and concepts and all that kind of stuff.
And it's really difficult to check that against film versus digital.
Right, and there are many great movies, I guess, that'll be an interesting concept in the future. Like when we completely get off film, can we actually call movies film?
Mm-hmm. Well,
But-
I think we've gotten to a point where film is a medium and not a
Right.
tool. I'm just looking at it from a perspective of for example, with 1922, there weren't really any issues with continuity, or they didn't have the footage, or they didn't have, what they needed to make the story make sense. Everything worked really well. But I feel like with 1922, it always felt very artificial, like you weren't actually in 1922, versus Professor Marston and the Wonder Women, where they did a really great job of both of the women looked very time period. I feel like Marston himself looked very modern. Almost a little too modern in the face.
I
But
thought
never-
Rebecca Hall looked a little too modern too. Really, the only person that I thought looked period was Olive.
Olive looked beautifully period. But that aside, I didn't have a problem at all buying into the time period. I really didn't. Until it got to the point where you had the interviews with Wonder Woman, and that had more to do with the script, not the way it was shot. Although, what's her name? Oh, I cannot believe I'm forgetting her name. Brighton? The woman from Friday Night Lights? The woman from Friday Night Lights. You all know who that is, I'm sure.
She was on the first season of American Horror Story as well.
That too. Her makeup was not very time period appropriate, I think. But other than that, I had no problem buying into the time period, except for the interview parts of the script where the line she was saying felt too much like the modern criticism of the time period of Wonder Woman, which I believe was exactly what those interviewing scenes were supposed to do. But when it came to all of the scenes with Marston and Olive and Elizabeth, I didn't have any problem buying into that immediately. But with 1922, that was like an ongoing battle I had with the movie, was buying into the period.
Yeah, and that's just unfortunately kind of the limitations of budget to a certain extent, but also
But
the
what was the
limitations of high def, like you illustrated.
That might be true, but even Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman, I'm pretty sure is an independent movie. An indie movie, so to speak.
I would say with almost absolute confidence that 1922 was on a smaller budget.
Well, it is a Netflix original, and Netflix originals have been very hit and miss, and also have had very successful and unsuccessful stories in terms of production.
Mm-hmm.
And before everybody gets upset when this actually happens, that's a reason why they're trying to push up the amount of money for your subscription, is because they're trying to finance their, millions of dollars worth of investments into original content.
Well, it's been proven, actually, that more people are watching Netflix originals than watching their other content.
Really?
Yes.
Like they're like other content, like say Disney or like pre-published work.
Yeah, people are watching.
Really?
People are watching Stranger Things. People are watching Orange Is the New Black. People are watching, their movies and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, more people are watching Netflix original content.
That's probably why, especially in America, the Netflix library has been shrinking. Because as long as more people are watching their original content anyway, why spend all the money to buy out the rights for all these other movies, when they're more interested in your original content, you could redistribute your funds into that. That actually makes a little bit more sense. Although,
I'm going to tell you one thing, and this is a little secret. There's a program on Google called Hola, Hola. It is your friend. And if you want to expose some more aspects of Netflix that might make you a little bit angry at the selection that Netflix has in the United States, check it out. It's free, and it's just an add-on on Google Chrome. Let me know what you think of it. I think it's pretty interesting to see what other countries are playing. Hell, you can watch the new Star Trek.
Which I'm going to say, no matter what anybody else says, because a lot of people are shitting on it, I think it's really good. But
yeah.
So, what do you guys think? Do you think that it really needs to be, any period film needs to be like excruciatingly accurate? Does it not really matter how you shoot it? I personally think you can take creative liberties in terms of the technology that you use, or some of the artistic choices that you use, as long as you're using things that feel period, in terms of maybe you use period techniques with a contemporary camera, or maybe you use period fabrics with the contemporary styling.
Now, to counter what you're saying right there, sorry, I have to bring this up. Public Enemies is a great example of how not to do this, which was a film that was very slavishly period, but they decided to shoot at a very high frame rate. They shot, I want to say, like 30 frames per second or something like that.
So they used a contemporary method of shooting.
Yeah.
I'm saying, like, what if you use period methods of shooting with contemporary equipment? Like, you use, like, a 4K, or, you know, you use, like, a red camera or something like that. But you shoot it with, you know, detailed foreground, middle ground, and background, like the time period. You know, something like that.
I mean, hell, I would like to see more movies do that, period, but that's just me.
So what do you guys think? Where is the line for what makes something feel period versus make it feel too contemporary to buy into the time period?
Yeah, let us know in the comments below. We're going to do a couple different podcasts about stuff like this. And if you want us to do more podcasts just talking about various aspects of film and less of a review thing and more of, you know, kind of broad conversation, let us know. Thanks for listening.